Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Shop Talk, hosted by the Triangle Area SQL Server Users Group. We have a full crowd tonight and a flash flood warning outside, so nothing possibly could go wrong here. I'm looking over to see how many frames I dropped already. All right, to my right, Tom Norman.
Hello, everyone. How are you doing tonight?
Fantastic. Everyone is doing fantastic. Howdy, TG, Anders, Raymond. Good to see you all so far. Directly to my south, Tracy Baggiano.
Hello, everyone.
And indirectly to my east, Mala Mahadevan.
Hello, everybody.
So, Shop Talk, the way it works is you have questions. Sometimes we have answers. Drop your questions in chat, or if you'd like, email them to shoptalk@tripass.org. And after the show, we'll check them out and include them as topics for future episodes. So tonight, I actually wanted to start things off with a discussion from a blog post that Kenneth Fisher put together. So I'm dropping the link in chat. And the question is, as a DBA, am I a gatekeeper? So Kenneth asks that question. Anders definitely says yes. And what do you think? What does everybody think? Let me first say that Kenneth actually does not pass Betteridge's Law of Headlines. Betteridge's Law of Headlines says that if you have a headline that ends in a question that can be answered yes or no, the answer is no. And yet his answer is yes. So I may have to explain to Kenneth that that's not how headlines work. So his point is that DBAs historically have been gatekeepers. You know, they have been the people to prevent the barbarian developers from ruining their environments. And there's a question about how much that is the case. Andrew says, I like to make devs feel like they get personalized attention from me. TG says, we're the last line of defense.
I think it is very organization dependent.
Okay, go on.
Well, the interesting part now with DevOps and everything that's going on with DevOps and the different ways people are developing. I know at least in my shop, basically we have pull requests or code reviews, and those code reviews, on database type of things, they are supposed to throw them my way or my partner's way so that we can review them. If they don't, excuse me, I can definitely go through the process of looking in Azure Data Studio, Azure data, and kind of see what is actually being changed before they go through it. And then I do have one final opportunity that the final build, I can look in there and I can actually see what's going to be changing on the database from into production. So I've got several different avenues that as a DBA, I can go review it. If I don't do it, that's my fault.
Yeah, that's fair. So I'm glad that Mike is here because I don't want this just to be, DBAs rubbing like kicking sand in the face of developers. So why didn't this look to devs who you thought you were taming as obstruction? And I think that's a reasonable is a reasonable point. Look, I'll lay out my biases that I'm a DBA at heart, so I'm gonna land on that side. That yeah, DBAs are the people who have to be willing to say stop, this is a bad idea, and here's why. But I also think that the DBA archetype can become ossified to the point of, this is an idea I'm just too lazy to implement, so stop. And it's important to remember that there is a difference between those two things.
Well,
I've
we
heard
also have like architects from the standpoint of, when we're looking at things, basically we look at them not only from a security standpoint, but from a performance standpoint. Is what's going to be implemented, does it appear as it's being implemented going to perform well? Or are you doing something like, I'm going to do a unique identifier as my clustered index, let's see if how well that performs. So,
or not having your columns that you're using in your where clause in an index on a very large table. Things like that you may need to consider, where the developers may not consider those things. They just write the code and they don't necessarily look at the table design and the indexes to see if something could help.
Or even you release something. Sorry, Tracy, didn't mean to cut you off.
That's all right. I was done.
No, I was just saying, when you release something, whatever you're changing, how long it can run in Mark and the DBS we have. Whenever I have something like that, when I have to put an index on a really large table or do something like that that has potential to be disruptive, then I need them to make a call on what's the right time for me to do it. Is this the best way to do it? Are there other ways around it? All of that stuff.
Yeah, and we have, where I work now, we have a target of like the top 20 tables that we know are like the biggest tables, that when we do code reviews, we scrutinize the predicates more so that we can make sure that they have appropriate indexes or not before we approve the code, because otherwise we know we're going to have bad performance.
Well, the other aspect of it is what if you're in a shop like mine and guess what they're using?
Functions.
Entity framework.
Oh, that's not as bad as using functions in your where clause.
Well, yeah, we've got some of those too, but you've got you got entity framework out there. And a lot of times when they're putting entity framework together, depending upon the version, the newer versions seem to be better and not as, why I started first looking at entity framework and some of the junk it was putting out, I was like going, who would ever write their query this way? But the new EF core seems to be a lot more in the fashion of which we would write code as a DBA.
Sometimes.
Yeah, we talked all about
Sometimes,
entity framework last week.
Yeah.
And all their different ones that could generate code.
So I missed that last week. I could have talked about that all day.
Yeah.
We did for like 30 minutes.
We milked that topic.
I think we only talked about 2 things the whole show.
I'm glad I stayed away because I definitely have some very strong opinions. Well, not as strong as I used to have. When I first got this job, they said, we'd use entity framework. And I was like, oh, what's that? And then I took the job and I found out what's that. So
the question changed from what's that to why is that?
Yeah. It's been okay, though. It's been all right.
So Anders says, we did it because you weren't here, Tom. We knew that you weren't going to be here, so we said, let's talk about a new framework this week. So I have a bit of a story that vaguely relates. I'm practicing for when I become an old man. I can tell completely unrelated old man stories. So I was at DerbyCon. This was about 8 years ago at this point, and one of the presenters for a session was, he was a security administrator at a school district. And he was the only security person for the entire school district. He had to deal with all of the computers for all of the students, all of the teachers. And they had some web filtering software. The web filtering software has ridiculous false positive rates. Teachers would be looking for websites and they'd get flagged as bad because maybe it was a shared domain. Like, I found this, we're going back far enough. I found this GeoCities page, and all of GeoCities is blocked because, well, a lot of GeoCities was worth blocking. But basically, teachers would say, look, I have this resource I want to give to my students, and I can't get to it. Help me out here. And as the security guy, his job, he could easily have been the guy to say, nope, the privacy filter worked, the system works, you're going to have to find some other site. But he realized, look, that wasn't going to work because teachers would find a way around it. They were going to find a way to circumvent the system. They'd figure out some method and would eventually probably do more harm than what they would have if his answer was, yes, let me help you out here. Let me go to the site. Every time you find you're blocked from a site that you think you should go to, email me, contact me, call me. Let's go to the site together. Let's make sure that it's okay. I'll add it to the list. I'll make sure that you're able to access it when it comes time to teaching. And that was his constant refrain, that yes, I am here to help you. He kind of turned the I am a gatekeeper on its head into I am a facilitator. It is not just my job. It's not my job to keep the barbarians away from the gates. It's my job to help people do the right things. These are people with access to tools that can do a lot of harm, and they may not know which end is the pointy end. So it's helping them keep from poking the pointy end in the wrong place. That analogy kind of fell off a little bit at the end, but the moral of the story was that same thing applies as database administrators, that there are times when you have to say no. All right, sysadmin across the board, no, that's not flying. And hopefully you know enough about the topic to be able to explain why that's a bad idea. If it comes down to it, yes, there are times when this just can't happen. There are job-ending events that you give everyone sysadmin, do it without me, because I don't want to be around when someone drops that database and somebody else deleted the backups because it was taking up too much disk space. Andrew says you say no, then you show them the right way. Yeah, and I think that's fair. Or actually, his response was always, I will never say no to somebody. I will always say yes, and then direct them to the correct answer. And so I want to see this site. Yes. Well, let me show you how we can do this the correct way. Or I need to deploy this code. Yes, let's go through this code review process, ensure that everything is working correctly. And if there are things that aren't good, we're going to find them, hopefully, and fix them before they go out, so that the developer doesn't then go to the other DBA and say, this is an emergency, it needs to go out. Or go to somebody who you didn't even know had administrative rights. Or take advantage of the fact that, oh, this application has administrative rights, and also there's a SQL injection vulnerability, so I can actually write update statements in this text box and click save, and it'll actually run the update statements, which happens. People are inventive.
That's a lot of good points, Kevin, in the fact that, as a DBA or as any tech person, especially as we learn more and more, and even if you are new, you can always teach an old dog new tricks, basically. And the thing of it is, as you educate people, it's going to help make your life easier in the first place. Then all the work is not going to end up on you. It's shared across many different people.
Yep. And
I fully agree. Yeah.
And we also, as DBAs, we also experience this. I mean, all of us here have worked with virtualization. There's always that first point where I'm the DBA. I want to be able to get these metrics from VMware, but the VMware admin has those metrics, so I need to be able to get access. And you can easily deal with a recalcitrant, calcified VMware admin who says, nope, I can't give you right to that process because you don't deserve it. You're not worthy of it. And
you gotta have beer. Did you take in beer?
I mean, there's
or donuts or food.
He didn't like me since the first year I worked there, so I sent my coworker over there, and he got it.
Right.
It was
Or
female male thing.
you try the logical route that's like, hey, all I need to have is monitoring rights. So I just need this right. It doesn't give me the right to do anything destructive. I just get to see these measures. But you know, we see those on our side as DBAs as well. I mean, developers get the same thing. Like, no, I don't want, as a developer, I don't want to go have the capacity to destroy this entire system because I don't want to get that call. I don't want to be on call. So all I want to do is get my job done, and good developers are going to say, I want to get my job done well. I want to do this the correct way. Help me do this the correct way. And I mean, it's kind of the philosophy that it's perfectly reasonable to say, yes, DBAs are gatekeepers. But like Mike mentions in the comment here, that if you're going to be a gatekeeper, remember that gates need to open and close. They're not just walls. And
well, it's interesting that today, a good example was a developer.
Well, the thing, Mike, also is that you can't always be a good gatekeeper. That's an incredibly difficult job because in a lot of situations, developers and managers, developer managers, they want to have their way. Okay, so you have to be willing to be a bad guy to them to some degree to protect it. There are absolutely environments where a collaborative approach works, and that's always pleasant and nice for everybody. But lots of places, some idea, some shiny new idea somebody saw and they want to go with it. And if you say no, you become the bad person. And unfortunately, there's a lot of places where that's true. And I've been asked in interviews if I have it in me to be the bad DBA, to be the gatekeeper who everybody hates because they have so many people who just want to have their own way. So, I don't know if that's possible.
Yeah, I had a scenario today that I had a developer basically ask me for some help with performance. And I said, sure, we'll look at it. And we got on together. And in actuality, we needed to see what the execution plan was. Well, in the environment in which he was in, he did not have rights to the execution, to view the execution plan. So basically temporarily gave him the rights. We looked at it, we talked about it, we talked about what was happening in the execution plan, and then we looked at indexes and see how we could basically improve the query. So he learned, and then I removed his rights back down. So that's the nice thing about, at least in my shop, basically, is I have in all my databases.
So collecting evidence helps.
In my databases, I basically have a read-only, read-write, and DBO role that basically they can put them in an AD role to escalate their privileges. And so I'm not always the gatekeeper of who gets into the database. My boss or my boss's boss can say, hey, this person needs to get in to do this, but they have to have rights to get escalated into the different environments or different roles.
And you were saying, Mala?
So I like to collect evidence where I am. When somebody has a new fancy idea, if you have evidence from the past that this didn't work, that helps sometimes. And the evidence I keep is for us are the number of times we walked back NoSQL projects into SQL Server. I'm 2 years old in this company and I've done 3 projects like that. So somebody has a fancy idea, I say, I had 3 projects I've done and I'm only here 2 years. Want me to do some more? Think this through. If this is really the right choice. Not because you read something, a blog post or something on it. So evidence-based approach definitely helps.
That does.
Yeah. So reading some chats here. Raymond says, is the most critical, valuable resource a company has. It is important to ensure the systems and data is safe, especially with security issues abound. Yeah, absolutely. Safety, right. That sort of security and safety, that's why we have DBAs.
Well, you even have laws now going into play like GDPR, CCPR, California Privacy Act and those type of things. So
Yeah, absolutely. Andrew says, in all fairness, I enlist devs to look over my code when I want to deploy something. Right. I mean, developer's not a black mark. I like to make fun of developers because it's just the roles people play, and it's fun to razz people. But no, developers can have a extremely deep subject matter knowledge, including in database work.
I reserve the right to make fun of developers because I used to be one.
Yeah, exactly.
Try and get away with it.
So TG says, I remember Mr. Spock, a baseball bat named after the shared sysadmin account the dev team used until I came in. Just imagine what happened when a dev asked if he could have Mr. Spock. Right. If you have a shared sysadmin account, this is a place where it's okay to say, no, that's not flying here. This is not a good place to be in.
I imagine the spot got deleted.
I'm sure. Well, until he came in, so yes.
Well, yeah, when he came in, he went delete.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
After he made sure he had his own admin account, of course.
So Raymond asks, okay, how do we as database people work with developers to show them the way? And I think TG has a good answer for this. I think we've hopefully shared some insights, but as a good DBA, you must find the line between enabling progress but preserving stability. There will not be a company if we roll out features and they fail, but there will also not be a company if we can't roll out new functionality at all. It's all about finding the balance, and of course, if you say no, you have to provide an alternative of how to do that. Right, and that goes back to the security case. And I also follow up with an in-house training if we discover a bad practice on how to do it right. Yeah, that's also a really good idea. So it kind of goes back to the security case of, I won't tell you no, I'll tell you yes, but there's a but after that yes. And that way it's going to get people to engage a bit more. If you tell someone no immediately, they start getting defensive. Like, okay, well, now I have to go fight this. And if you say yes, but here's what we're going to need to do. Yes, but is the new no. Exactly. Yes, but, instead of, I don't know, putting in this 6 billion row table and trying to fit it into this server that has 4 gigs of RAM, maybe we should instead figure out what you actually need. And then when we find out that it's only 150 rows, we could use that instead. So yeah, that's, and I think working with teams, it takes time to work with teams in question to guide them where they need to be, says Raymond. And absolutely, and I think that's part of helping developers understand. And same thing with developers helping DBAs understand. Like, okay, DBAs, how many times have you gone to a developer and say, I've messed up Git, how do I fix this?
What's also interesting that, that you listen to them, because they very well may have a very good reason of what they're trying to do. And then you might be able to compromise with what you need to work with. Because if you're working with something like a microservice type of system, there are things that you're going to have to do, that technically you're going to need to do as a DBA that just goes totally against your grain.
Yeah.
I.e. having 2 address tables or 2 city tables because they cross, microservices and stuff like that. You're like going, no, I only need 1.
Right. No, I get that. Microservices, I have a love-hate relationship with. And another thing,
Yes.
actually, coming from TG, a good track record of suggesting good solutions helps over time. Yeah, there's, it's like any other interpersonal relationship. If I like you, I'm more inclined to do things for you and work with you. If I hate you, it takes all of my professionalism not to just say no gleefully just to say no. So yeah, having part of that I like you is you have shown me that you are good at what you do. You are capable of doing more than I found an answer on Stack Overflow, let's put it in production, and have some reasonable chain of logic for things. Let's work together to figure out the best way to do this. So yeah, that's absolutely right. And over time, you build up that trust. I mean, that's a trust factor right there. And Tom mentioned the go buy alcohol and sweets. That builds up gratitude. That's a gratitude factor.
I tried it as a bribe. It did not work.
Well, the other aspect.
I timed the event that made the guy not like me. I took him out for beers. It did not work.
The other aspect.
A hate relationship.
The other aspect to realize is that we know that we all work in a very broad subject matter area, and even though we know, a specific topic, we remember it from 2 years ago, do we basically have the best idea? For example, we actually tried to use SQL hierarchy. Well, come to find out, SQL hierarchy, even though it's a great concept, it's a horrible in performance. So sometimes you don't necessarily, have that. You've heard of the concept, but maybe you've never implemented it or whatever. And that's where Twitter helps. Twitter or whatever, and talking to other people too.
Yeah, and I'll take it the other way. Not just we tried something, it went wrong, but also here's this thing. Like I had a manager who hadn't used the apply operator before. So I started showing off apply in the code base, and the response was, wait, what is this? Why are you putting this in here? And it took a little bit of time to explain, to clarify. I mean, it was good that we were already both database professionals. There was already enough trust involved that, okay, this isn't just some clown who's throwing weird stuff in the code just to be weird. Not just to be weird. But even if you are a professional in the field who has spent a significant amount of time and become good at this, there's a lot of blank spaces. There's a lot of blind spots, and
yes, there is.
Certainly can learn other things. So auto no isn't great. Although, admittedly, I am enough of a curmudgeon that auto no is what I do in my head, and then I have to explain to myself in my head, all right, I can't do that. I can't just say no.
Hey, we can go, it depends.
Yeah, it depends. Let's go do some research.
The typical DBA answer, it depends.
Or you try it and 3 versions later you say it sucks, but now it's been fixed.
Yeah, that could very well be true too.
Yep. Like extended events.
Like linked servers. I don't use them. Still don't use them.
I don't think linked servers were ever fixed.
No, they're not fixed yet.
Because you implied that when you 3 versions and they're fixed, and I was like, when did that happen?
Try it. You'll like it.
I loved linked servers until they stopped working.
I know too many places that put SA and the password in linked servers to like them.
Well, that way it's easier.
Yeah, I realize how easy that is, but it's still it makes me barf.
So Raymond says
replication.
Yeah, replication still ain't fixed either after all these versions.
Replication's fixed. It's just that nobody understands how it works except for Chris Skorlinski.
Yeah. True. If it breaks, we're like going, I don't know where to fix this thing.
Actually,
well, transactional replication works pretty well. It's the merge replication that's kind of.
Yeah, I'll say actually, in fairness, it's Chris Skorlinski and Hillary Cotter. Both of them understand replication. So there are 2 people on this planet, which means that the bus factor is not 0.
So we need to make friends with those 2 people.
Chris actually is pretty close to local. He's out of Charlotte.
Yeah, I know he came up for one of their presentations one time a few years ago.
Yep.
And Hillary does some of the SQL Saturdays, so it can't be that hard to make friends with the two of them.
It's true. Andrew says replication is hard. Conceptually, no. In practice, yes, because data models are all garbage. If your data model's good and you're not trying to push replication to insane levels, yeah, it just works. But data models tend to be garbage. Okay, so next up, next topic. Unless anybody has anything else on the DBA as a gatekeeper. TG says, also as a good DBA, provide the dev teams with realistic test environments. That's a, yeah. Just had a case where the dev instance had 100 rows and prod had 16 billion rows. So everyone wondered why the 600 line join with correlated subqueries and unions didn't work well in production. And I mean, we can all laugh about that obviously, yeah, this thing's not going to work. But no, it's a fair point that, look, if I'm a developer, yeah, as a DBA, we get the advantage of I get to run the queries in production. So I can see pretty immediately that, oh, this isn't going to work well. But if you're a developer, oftentimes you don't get to run this stuff in production. You get to run the stuff in dev where you created the rows yourself, and that means that there's like 300 rows that have been there for 7 years, and nobody's allowed to update anything because the last time somebody tried to update it broke someone's unit test that was depending on that data being there.
Or you obfuscate your data if your database is not in the terabyte range and give it to them and let them go have fun with it.
Yeah, no, that's a good solution. That's a really good reason to do that kind of thing if you're able to. Even if you're not able to, having sufficient test data. Yeah, having that be around. You know, give people the tools they need to do their jobs, and sometimes it's obvious in that case, you have the giant query, it's not going to work well on a 16 billion row table. But there are many cases where, look, I don't know how many rows there are in here, but it seems like a reasonable query until you find out that it doesn't work in production because of data skew or because of a lot more rows than you expected to have. So yeah,
Right.
that's not even on the developers. Like, they don't necessarily know that they couldn't do that it wouldn't work because, well, all I get to do is test it against development.
Well, the data selectivity and data skew is probably, is very valid, on things that happen.
Yeah. Now, think about writing third-party software with different database sizes, different usage patterns, says Anders. Right. That's why I don't think about that.
Yep.
Okay, so next topic. This is a fun topic. Mala brought this one up. Is there a place in this world for heap tables?
I love heap tables. The answer for me is
So
yes.
I'll go first. I think there is absolutely a place, although I would be very careful about it. Like what Tom said before we started the show, like really, really small tables or tables that are barely used, but the indexes are sitting out there taking a huge amount of space. That kind of stuff, or in some cases even some staging tables, which may not need the necessary index to operate. That there are valid situations in my opinion, although one has to be sure that that's what you need.
Yeah, ours is enum tables with they have less than 50 rows in the table. You've got something like that, it's going to be a reference table. There's not going to be a bunch of data added to it. There's some valid reasons. You start getting though a real working table, then No, you would probably want an index.
What do you say, Tracy?
I'm with Tom. Make sure it's a clustered index.
Oh, absolutely.
That way it won't be a silly heap. Make sure everybody knew that.
Well, we should extend your question, Kevin. Is a heap table good? Should every table have a clustered index?
All but the heap tables.
All but the heap table.
Yeah, so that's asking side of the same coin. So
You
TG
could have
says
just non-clustered indexes.
Yeah, you could have those on the heap tables.
yeah, but still, it's a heap table or a
For
table
the
with a clustered
director
index.
all over the place if it's
Yeah.
right being used normally.
So
I happen to know one that's
Or
going to
non-indexed heap table. Let's put it that way.
yeah, this is even heap tables. You can have non-clustered indexes on them in the bounds of the question.
Yeah, okay.
Should heap tables exist at all? And TG says yes, they should exist in a museum. I like that answer. So Anders says, hey, I've had a multi-terabyte heap table, collecting data from CNC machines, millions of records per hour, where write performance is the most important thing. Yeah, if you have effectively write-only tables, heaps can be useful for that.
Right.
If you have tiny tables like Tom's talking about, where everything fits on one page, frankly, it doesn't matter if you have a heap. Actually, it's faster if you have a heap because you don't have the clustered index where you're looking down to get the one page. You just get the one page. If you have a temporary table, well, most of the time those are going to be heaps. You can certainly put clustered indexes on temp tables, and there are times when you want to. But, you know, by default, I'm not going to put a clustered index on a temp table, just because I don't need it. I'm just lazy. I can also see, so not once the table reaches a certain size, then the writes do slow down, more than 50 terabytes. Yeah, though, if you're talking 50 terabytes, that's a fairly small percentage of tables in this planet are 50 plus terabytes. But that is a fair point. Once you're at that level, yeah, writes can slow down. And any sort of reading of the data can be tricky. One case. Yeah, if you just need to... So, Solomon says, completely agree with Anders. Large volume writes, infrequent reads, especially with no range scans, then yes, heaps. Right, and one place where you could say, I want to have a heap if I always scan 100% of data. I'm going to have to go through all of the pages regardless. I don't think it's going to make a huge difference, although I could be wrong, and please do tell me I'm wrong, chat. Tell me I'm wrong. One other place, actually, that I wanted to throw out as a scenario that nobody's going to think about. SQL pools and Azure Synapse Analytics. So if you're building out tables in Synapse Analytics and you don't have a minimum of 1 million rows per partition, you're not going to take advantage of the clustered column store index. At least if you don't have 102,400 rows, you're not going to take advantage of that thing. You can plop a non-column store clustered index on there, but that's only going to be useful for point lookups with SQL pools. Because this is data that's partitioned across 60 separate instances. So in those cases, if you're not doing point lookups, frequent point lookups, not having a clustered index at all is considered better for your table than going with one of the two bad options. So in many plans, the sort of the clustered index will help you. True. And if you have a table that has grown over time and has a bunch of, say, what are they, row forwards, where you're pointing, you have a bunch of like half empty pages that are pointing to other places where you can end up with many more pages used than if you reorganized everything in a clustered index. There is that risk. But in your ideal scenario of essentially write ahead logging with here's all of my data that I'm just constantly writing to, and I'm not really updating it, I'm just continuing to write to it.
Because maintenance plans and all the scripts do not take care of heap tables as far as fragmentation goes.
Yeah, pretty much nobody takes care of fragmentation on heaps, because my recollection is the solution for fixing fragmentation on a heap is build a clustered index and then drop the clustered index.
No, you can rebuild the table and fix it. You don't have to build a clustered index and drop it.
Okay. That might have been, I want to say that was like last few versions of SQL Server then. Because I remember at one point the accepted solution was build the clustered index and then drop it. And I remember Paul Randall making a joke about it, saying, look, if you're going to waste the time building a clustered index, why not just keep the thing?
I just looked it up in documentation for someone like last week. Literally, we were talking heap tables, so that's the only reason I remembered the solution.
Okay. Solomon says heaps and clusters fill differently. Cluster tables have a better sense of free space and fill better, which can be important. Yeah, that can be important. If we're talking close to the ideal scenario for writing, it's less important. But as you get to weirder, like larger sets of data where each record can have several columns that are thousands of bytes long, where you're talking about going to lob, where you're talking about additional pages, overflow. Yeah, heaps get funky. Rebuild heap started in 2012 or shortly thereafter. Previously was add cluster and drop. Okay, yeah, I did remember that.
I did remember it too, but I remember it's been that way for at least a couple of versions anyways.
So yeah, sounds like it was added to SQL Server 2012, which sounds right. That was a great version for adding stuff. So Solomon also says, I would also expect to not have a primary key on a non-clustered index, since we are excluding clustered here. Since if a primary key is needed for the purpose of a foreign key, then clustered includes index keys instead of a row ID. Right, this is, yeah, if you have proper relations and key constraints, and you're talking about something that's more than the one page example like Tom's mentioning, then you're right, Solomon.
There's no reason you can't throw an entity column on there and make it a primary key, even if you're not using it anywhere for a relationship. You never know, your need might change later.
Yeah, but Solomon's point is that the key constraint would include the row ID, whereas the clustered index would include the identity integer value.
Yeah.
So TG says, for the write speed, a lot of changes in 2017 and 2019, and with large data, you should do bulk inserts, and they work on clustered as well these days. Yes, some of the advice around heaps tended to work better does apply more to older versions of SQL Server. And going back to, hey, old DBAs learn new tricks. Try things out. Just because this advice was valid 10 years ago, like add a clustered index and drop it, doesn't mean it's still valid today. Anders believes that in the background. So according to Redgate, rebuild heap started in 2008. I thought I remembered it being a later version than that. I thought I remembered it being 2012. But okay, I accept my failings. So Anders says that in the background he thinks that rebuild table is just secretly adding a clustered index and dropping it. Which would be funny if it were true. So we have this value of heaps. So Tom, when you have your heap tables, how often do you add non-clustered indexes?
The small ones I don't. Bigger ones, I'm of the camp that a clustered index should always be on every table. That's not that's not small in a heap. So I don't necessarily have just a table, with nothing but non-clustereds on it.
Okay. Mala, Tracy?
What was the question, Kevin? Sorry, I missed it.
Sorry. If you have any heap tables that include non-clustered indexes, or if you have cases where you'd say, yeah, that seems like a smart idea, as opposed to, yeah, that seems like a bad idea.
If I'm
My answer is the same as Tom. If it's a really small table, then I don't bother. If it's a somewhat medium-sized table, then yeah.
my
But
answer,
in reality, I'm not faced with any situation right now where I have a heap table. I have in the past for some staging purposes and all the reasons that are discussed on the chat. But right now I don't. So whether they have non-clustered indexes, I would say it just depends. Very much, a need-based thing.
Okay. Tracy?
if I have a table that's a heap table that's big enough to have a non-clustered index, I'm also going to put a clustered index on it, just because it makes all the leaf thingies all nice and pretty and
Valid.
easier to index maintenance and all that stuff and keep the table small, page-wise.
Fair. Raymond says, I've run into cases where usage is clustered on identities versus columns data organization. What are our collective practices besides it depends? So I'm not sure the question. If Raymond is talking about, so Raymond, are you talking about whether to use natural keys versus surrogate keys for the clustered index? In other words, have an identity column or use the combination versus using the combination of columns that makes a record unique? Okay, yes, organization of data. So what do you folks think? What do you find folks believe?
I like my identity columns.
I like my identity columns too.
So do I. I think we all do.
I guess I'll be the it depends guy.
There's no reason you can't put that on there as an alternate key to make sure the data stays valid.
Yes, definitely want to have that as at the very least a unique index or
having it as your primary, because it gets bigger. You want your clustered index as small as possible so that your leaf tables things stay small, and it doesn't have to transverse as much. Otherwise, that just blows up and gets bigger, and you're making more space and more memory you're using. So I always go with the smallest thing, which would be an int or a big int if I plan on going past 2 billion records.
Mm-hmm. Anders scoffs and talks about a 15-column natural clustered primary key, which is great until you get to the joins where someone forgets a few of those columns.
GUIDs are great too until you suck them into an ETL package that can't comprehend GUIDs and makes them 32 characters in your
36.
database.
Don't forget the hyphens.
36 or somewhere in there.
Yeah, it's 36 with the hyphens. Nah, that's what views are for. Ugh.
No, they gotta be in a different server.
So, yeah, look, I will also lay out that my bias is
Servers that work great.
Link servers. There you go. Now we're tying it back to link servers. Yeah, my bias is I like having that identity column or that sequence column. I can understand cases where you might not want it. Like if you have one access pattern for this table, then clustering on that access pattern, especially if it is properly unique, seems like it would be a better option for you. If you have something that is naturally monotonically increasing, that could be a reasonable option. But almost all the time I'm going to say, even if you get some very minor performance improvement from not using an identity value, you'll probably lose that in some other place. And keeping the identity value is usually going to be easier for people to understand, easier for people to follow, and it's easier to lay out as this is a practice that you should generally follow. I can see exceptions. I can see cases where you're talking about extreme amounts of data. Yeah, I can see cases where, hey, this is a column store index. I'm not doing point lookup in a column store index, or this is a fact table. You know, I'm basically saying the same thing. With a fact table, you don't really need unique IDs because the facts don't have to be unique. The facts just have to exist. They have to be there. We can toss on some identifiers so that it's easier for us as humans to recognize data problems. But you know, there's technically in the Kimball model, you don't want those. But those surrogate identifiers for rows are actually harmful because they don't provide any valuable information, and you don't want to look for them. You don't want them to exist. So Solomon says, run into this sometimes. There's no point in a clustered identity if it's not used. So you could cluster on something else but still have the identity, even if only to add to the clustered keys to guarantee uniqueness and avoid the unifier. Anders says that the problem with identity columns is that users start to reference them, and now you can never change them. So in this case, Mala then asked, reference them how? Like Anders says, policy number, or where developers start including it in the URL, where you have /users/12345. And
security alert.
I mean, yeah, that is, or if you're talking about something that's a bit more benign than users, but yeah, if that's now exposed in the URL, well, that surrogate value took on a meaning. It's no longer quite so surrogate. Anders says your PK should never be seen by users. I would revise that mildly and say surrogate keys ideally should never be seen by users because they don't have a meaning, they don't have a business value, and if you're going to expose them in a URL, you've given them business value so that, yeah, you can't change it. And also, if you use an identity on something like a policy number, and some accountant is looking back, I have policy 5006 and 5008. Well, what happened to policy 5007? Now having to explain to them that, yeah, identity columns don't always go up by 1. Sometimes transactions roll back. Sometimes servers restart and they jump by 1,000 because of caching. Sometimes weird stuff happens and the identity value gets reset because a developer decided to change it. This is why I like GUIDs. And I can't even finish what Anders said. Like you just said I don't like surrogate keys, so here's why I like a surrogate key. Come on, Anders. Although, at least in the unique identifier case, the GUID case, yeah, there's no assumption that you go from 1 2 3 4 5 to 1 2 3 4 6. It's just two values. Two values in the night. How about include columns and indexes for queries? Yes?
Sure, why not?
Hey, if they help.
They help.
If
Filter
they help.
indexes as well.
But GUIDs are not unique. So I can actually tell the story. I have actually had a GUID collision once. I had 2 GUIDs generated at different times that were exactly the same. The odds of this happening are supposed to be infinitesimal, but it can happen. you can have collisions. They are extremely rare. I've only had it happen once.
Were you using a sequential?
No, it wasn't sequential. It was just new ID or GUID.new in .NET. And 2 different servers popped up. One ID had a collision, caused an error. Had to figure out what was going on there. I'm like, it generated the same ID as something that already existed. Bet it was in VMs. Yes, it was in VMs, TG. So, yeah, and I think I know where you're going with that, where with virtual machines, like on Linux, dev random doesn't always get all of the bits of entropy that it needs. And so it can generate, basically, it doesn't have, it can generate numbers that are not as random, as pseudo-random as you'd like them to be. Solomon says that there are only surrogate keys and not understood to be surrogate keys. So there's no such thing as natural keys. Just going to leave that one right there. TG says VMs have no concept of time and space, which are 2 elements used to generate GUIDs. Right. Yeah, it goes back to that entropy. So actually there are USB sticks that you can plug into a server that essentially replicate, they take over for dev random and use generated noise and help in that scenario. Also, when you create an SSH key in something like PuTTY, it'll say move your mouse around a bunch in this area. So you just move your mouse around and it takes those pointer locations and it uses that as the feed for generating pseudo-random results. That if you move the mouse exactly the same way a second time, you could get the same results potentially.
I would like to see you get move it the exact same way.
Yeah, I can barely get it to move the right way once. So I think we've beat heap tables to their natural conclusion, which is to become dead horses. So let's talk about Mala's book corner as we wrap things up. Only got a couple minutes left. But
give me just a minute. The books are right behind me. I'll get them.
So while Mala's doing that, let's beat the dead horse just a little bit more, I guess.
Okay, 2 books today, like it is every week. The first one is a little bit older one, Troubleshooting SQL Server, a guide for the accidental DBA by Jonathan Cahayas and Ted Kruger. This is, again, one of the rare old tech books that I personally still keep, and I recommend it, highly recommend it to anyone getting started as a DBA, because there are many enhancements and changes made after this book. I don't think they came out with anything new after 2012. This is based on 2012. But the concepts are outlined excellently well. So any DBA who is going into his work for the first time, or even somebody like me who have challenges with explaining things even though I know them, this is an excellent reference on how you can explain deadlocks, how you can explain how the transaction log works, how you can explain blocking, any of that. And what they say here is still 99% still valid. So it's a cheap book. I think it used to be $30, and the e-download from Redgate is still totally free. So highly recommend. 5 on 5. And I wish they had written an update to it, but neither of them say they have time to do that. The next book is Beautiful Evidence by Edward Tufte. And he has written a lot of books. He is what I call the Joe Selko of the visualization world. He can be controversial. He's very opinionated, but he is brilliant and he's a total master of his subject. And this book is sort of like, it's not something you want to read from page to page, but you can just keep it on your table and read a little bit at a time. And the graphics and the visuals in the book are just amazing. And there is an English translation of Napoleon's invasion of Russia, the map. I will honestly confess, I love that. I still look at that. It is amazing. And it has everything that you can expect from, an Edward Tufte class in small forms. And he can be repetitive, and he does devote an entire chapter to bashing PowerPoint, which is his favorite hobby. And I strongly recommend nobody argue with him on that subject. He's not going to budge or change his mind even a teeny bit. But, so whether you agree with him or not on that really doesn't matter. But there is lots to read outside of that with some great, drawings and pages. And it's mostly about how visualization has evolved over time. It's not, I wouldn't even call it a technical book. I asked my sister, who's not into IT, even to read it, and she found it fascinating. It's just how people interpret information that is not presented in verbal form. It's essentially that. And, he does a great job explaining that. So it is expensive, and the paper is very, very good and all of that, but it's worth your money.
Yeah, it's really high quality. It's part of a whole set of books along these topics.
Right.
It is the biggest one, so if you're looking for bang for buck, and I snickered because I popped open to the page of the Napoleon graph, which is sort of Tufte's calling card. He loves that Napoleon graph to the point where I say, I think he goes too far with it.
He does. He's obsessed about a lot of things. That's one of them.
He's like, this is possibly the greatest visual ever created. And my problem with it is that it is a wonderful visual once he explains it to you for 10 minutes. That until he explains it to you for 10 minutes, the thing doesn't make sense. Was he compensating for something? Look, Napoleon was perfectly average in height, okay? He was a perfectly average.
So if anyone's looking to attend one of Tufte's classes, I highly recommend it because he's a fascinating storyteller. I mean, you can just sit there. Even a non-tech person can listen to that and be totally, transfixed by what he's saying. He's got stories all over the world about, what was a good visualization, what went wrong and what didn't, and all of that. Just don't expect to come away with some real skills that you can put to at work. That you will not get. Yeah, you will get a lot of history and anecdotes and stories and best practices.
Yeah, it's definitely
more. So if you have the money and you can afford it, go for it.
More of an idea thing. I was able to go to it. I took my entire team to it for training, and it was a lot of fun. We got the books, and actually the coolest part of that was where he was talking about visualizing music, and how there's a tool that can take music, take different instruments, and as the instruments are playing, it moves little dots of light around. And as you watch it, you can plug your ears, not even hear what's going on, just see the lights, and the music plays in your head because you get what's happening just because of now there's this motion, there's this movement, the cello has picked back up, the violin has dropped off. So it was definitely an interesting week. So with that, Raymond has a topic for next week: refactoring databases, practices, and planning. Yeah, I will add that to the list. And Andrew says, don't understand music when I hear it. You might understand it better when you see it. You may even find a couple things on YouTube about it. I know that I went looking afterwards because it seemed so cool. I've seen a few cases. There's a commercial product that I wasn't going to shell out any money for because I have no use for it. But I think I saw a couple YouTube videos where they showed this thing in action. But yeah, Raymond, we will add that to the topic list for next week. And with that, we're going to call it an evening. Thanks everybody so much for dropping in with us tonight. Appreciate you coming in. All the chat, all the wonderful interaction with everybody, and we will catch you tomorrow, hopefully, where Brian Shalloway will, for real this time, be available to present. There was some last-minute stuff that came up. He wasn't able to present last week, so we're able to get him for tomorrow. So we'll have that. And then next Monday, more shop talk. So see you all there.
Bye-bye.